In a small, quiet town where everyone knew everyone, the case of Mr. Stanisław sent shockwaves through the local community. Stanisław, an elderly shopkeeper who had run a small corner store on the main street for decades, was known for his honesty and generous heart. He was the type of person who would help neighbors in need, allowing them to put their purchases on credit when money was tight. That's why the accusations that he had embezzled money from a charity fund, money that the townspeople had collected to support the poorest families, were so shocking. The evidence against him was circumstantial, but some of it seemed difficult to dispute. Someone had found documents with Stanisław's signature on them and a missing amount of money, while the testimony of an anonymous witness further incriminated the shopkeeper. Rumors spread that the money might have been used to pay off debts that had been the subject of town gossip for some time. In this small town, where everyone knew everyone, doubts quickly turned into judgments. Stanisław was devastated. He sat in his cramped apartment above the store, which felt even smaller as he thought about the upcoming trial. He had no family to turn to for support. His savings barely covered his living expenses, let alone the cost of hiring a lawyer. "I've worked honestly all my life. Why would someone want to frame me?" he asked himself repeatedly, sinking deeper into despair. He felt he had no choice but to accept that he would forever be branded as a cruel thief. That evening, as the sun was setting, there was a knock on his door. It was Piotrek, a 17-year-old whom Stanisław remembered from his childhood, as a boy who often ran through the streets with a book tucked under his arm. Piotrek wasn't like the other kids. He was quiet, thoughtful, and often kept to himself. The townsfolk viewed him as an oddity, someone who didn't quite fit into their small world. "Good evening, Mr. Stanisław," Piotrek began hesitantly, shoving his hands into the pockets of his tattered jacket. "Good evening, Piotrek. What brings you here?" Stanisław asked, surprised by the unexpected visit. "I heard about your situation," Piotrek said, pausing as if gathering his courage, "and I want to help." Stanisław raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "Help? How exactly?" Piotrek looked at him seriously, though there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "I've been studying the law, and I think I can represent you," he said quickly, as though afraid he might lose his nerve if he hesitated any longer. Stanisław let out a short laugh but quickly stopped when he saw the determination in the boy's eyes. "Piotrek, this isn't a game. You're not a lawyer. They'll have professionals, people who've studied law and know all the codes. You, please, trust me," Piotrek interrupted, his voice steady despite the doubt in his eyes. "I can't promise miracles, but I'll do everything I can. And if it doesn't work, you've got nothing to lose anyway." Stanisław sighed deeply. His situation was hopeless, and the boy's proposal sounded absurd. But there was something in Piotrek's tone, something in the way he stood, that made Stanisław decide to take the chance. "All right, fine. But if this doesn't work—" "It will," Piotrek promised, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. A few days later, the small courtroom in the town was packed to the brim. The townspeople had come out in droves, some out of curiosity, some convinced of Stanisław's guilt, and others simply to see whether the quiet boy, Piotrek, would truly try something as audacious as defending the elderly shopkeeper in court. The courtroom was small and stuffy, with rows of wooden benches that looked like they'd been there for decades. Groups of townspeople leaned against the walls, whispering amongst themselves and occasionally glancing toward the door. "What are they thinking?" an older woman whispered, shaking her head in disapproval. "This is a court, not some kind of children's play. Have you ever seen anything like it?" A man in a hat replied, smirking. "It's going to be quite the spectacle." At last, the courtroom doors swung open, and they walked in. Stanisław hunched over, his face pale and weary from sleepless nights, and Piotrek, standing tall with a briefcase in hand that looked far too big for him. Their entrance caused a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "This has to be a joke," someone hissed from the back. "He's just a boy." But Piotrek seemed unbothered. His gaze was focused, and his steps were steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Stanisław glanced at him sideways, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation, but the boy's face betrayed nothing. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood. Once they were seated, the trial began with the reading of the charges. "So, we have a young man here who wishes to defend Mr. Kowalski?" the judge asked, his voice laced with irony. "Well then, why don't you start by explaining how you plan to handle such serious accusations? I'm very curious to see if youth comes with experience." The courtroom erupted in laughter, and a few jurors exchanged amused glances. Even the prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man who usually kept a professional demeanor, smirked as he glanced at Piotrek. The boy felt his palms grow clammy, but he stood firm, refusing to let the room's scorn shake him. The prosecutor began with a confident opening statement, highlighting the evidence. The missing funds, the signed documents, and the anonymous testimony that all pointed to Stanisław's guilt. He painted a picture of a man so desperate to pay off his debts that he stole from the charity fund. When it was Piotrek's turn to speak, the room fell silent. The boy stood, adjusted his borrowed suit jacket, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but soft, "I intend to prove that my client, Mr. Stanisław Kowalski, is innocent, and that the prosecution's evidence is not only circumstantial but riddled with inconsistencies." A low chuckle rippled through the room, but the judge silenced it with a sharp glance. "Proceed," he said, his tone now less mocking and more curious. Piotrek launched into his defense, first questioning the credibility of the anonymous witness. "Why is their identity being concealed?" he asked. "What guarantees do we have that this person had access to accurate information?" Next, he tackled the signed documents that the prosecution had presented as evidence. "The prosecution claims these documents bear my client's signature. However, I've obtained a handwriting analysis that suggests the signature may have been forged. I request permission to present the findings of a handwriting expert I've called to testify." The room buzzed with murmurs of surprise. The prosecutor frowned, clearly caught off guard. Piotrek continued, addressing the supposed motive. "The prosecution alleges that my client stole money to pay off debts. Yet not a single creditor has come forward to confirm these debts exist. Why? Because they don't." As Piotrek spoke, the mood in the courtroom began to shift. The townsfolk, who had entered the room skeptical of the boy, started to listen intently. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. When it came time to cross-examine the witnesses, Piotrek's sharp questioning revealed cracks in the prosecution's case. One by one, the witnesses faltered under his calm but pointed interrogation. Piotrek's sharp cross-examination continued to unravel the prosecution's case. Witness after witness stumbled under his questions, revealing inconsistencies in their statements. "Can you confirm," Piotrek asked one of the prosecution's key witnesses, "that you personally saw Mr. Kowalski signing the document in question?" "Well, no," the witness stammered. "But I heard." "Heard from whom?" Piotrek interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "We're in a court of law. Hearsay is not evidence." The witness froze, unsure how to respond. The courtroom murmured with intrigue. Even the judge, who had initially seemed dismissive of Piotrek, was now leaning forward, watching the young man closely. Piotrek then addressed the anonymous witness whose testimony was central to the prosecution's argument. "Why has this witness not come forward in person?" he asked the court. "How can we verify their credibility? How can we trust testimony from someone who is unwilling to stand here and be questioned?" The prosecutor objected, claiming the witness's anonymity was necessary for their safety. But Piotrek countered swiftly. "Your Honor, anonymity in this case serves no purpose but to shield the prosecution from scrutiny. If the witness has nothing to hide, they should be here to defend their claims." The judge nodded thoughtfully, and the prosecutor, for the first time, looked uneasy. Finally, Piotrek turned to the documents, the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence. He called a handwriting expert to the stand, a professional he had managed to persuade to help pro bono after explaining Stanisław's dire situation. The expert testified that the signatures on the documents bore significant differences from Stanisław's usual handwriting. They pointed out inconsistencies in the loops and strokes, concluding that it was highly likely the signature had been forged. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The prosecutor tried to object, but the judge overruled him, clearly intrigued by the evidence. The trial stretched on for hours, but Piotrek's arguments continued to chip away at the prosecution's case. By the time he delivered his closing statement, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Piotrek stood tall, his voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, this case is not just about Mr. Kowalski. It's about the principle of justice. It's about ensuring that no innocent person is condemned without solid, irrefutable evidence. The prosecution has presented a narrative filled with assumptions and gaps. They have relied on anonymous testimony, hearsay, and forged documents. But assumptions are not facts and gaps are not proof. My client, Mr. Stanisław Kowalski, is a man who has lived his life with honesty and integrity. He is a pillar of this community, a man who has helped countless people in their times of need. To accuse him of stealing from the very community he has supported is not only baseless but cruel. I urge this court to see the truth, to see that there is no evidence, none, that links my client to this crime. To convict him would not be justice. It would be a miscarriage of it." The courtroom was silent as Piotrek returned to his seat. Even those who had doubted him at the start now watched him with respect. The judge called for a recess to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited for the verdict. Stanisław sat next to Piotrek, his hands trembling slightly. "You've done more than I could have ever hoped for," Stanisław whispered. "No matter what happens, thank you." Piotrek placed a reassuring hand on the older man's shoulder. "We're not done yet." When the judge returned, the room fell silent. He cleared his throat and looked directly at Stanisław. "After reviewing the evidence and the arguments presented, this court finds the defendant, Mr. Stanisław Kowalski, not guilty of all charges." The room erupted into murmurs, then applause. Stanisław slumped in his seat, tears streaming down his face. Piotrek smiled faintly, the weight of the trial finally lifting off his shoulders. Word of the trial spread quickly through the town. Piotrek, once seen as an odd and quiet boy, was now hailed as a hero. People stopped him on the street to congratulate him, and some even asked for his help with their own legal troubles. But Piotrek remained humble, focusing on his studies and quietly planning his future. As for Stanisław, he returned to his shop, where business began to boom. The townspeople, eager to show their support, flocked to his store. Though the trial had left scars, Stanisław found solace in the kindness of his neighbors, and in the knowledge that justice had prevailed. Months later, Piotrek received an unexpected visit. It was the judge who had presided over Stanisław's trial. "I must admit," the judge said, "when I first saw you walk into that courtroom, I thought it was a joke, but you proved me wrong. You have a gift, Piotrek, a talent for seeing the truth and fighting for it. Have you considered pursuing a career in law?" Piotrek nodded. "It's all I've ever wanted." The judge smiled. "Good, because I have a proposition for you. I'd like you to intern with me, learn the ropes. You've got the passion. Now it's time to refine it." Piotrek was stunned. The judge, who had once mocked him, was now offering to mentor him. It was an opportunity he couldn't refuse. Over the years, Piotrek grew into a skilled and respected lawyer. He never forgot his first case or the man who had given him a chance to prove himself. He often visited Stanisław, bringing him small gifts and updates on his life. One day, Piotrek surprised Stanisław with an envelope full of money. "This is for you," Piotrek said. "Use it to take a break, to travel, to do whatever you've always dreamed of." Stanisław tried to refuse, but Piotrek insisted. "You believed in me when no one else did," he said. "This is the least I can do." Years later, Piotrek's name became synonymous with justice and integrity. He took on cases that others deemed unwinnable, always fighting for the underdog. And through it all, he carried with him the lessons he had learned from that small-town courtroom: the importance of courage, determination, and standing up for what's right. Moral of the story: no matter how small or powerless you feel, determination and belief in justice can overcome even the greatest odds. Both Stanisław and Piotrek proved that it's never too late to fight for what's right and never too early to start making a difference.